Right. Good evening, everyone. I'd forgotten what this lecture theatre was like. It's slightly like being in a tennis match. So I'll try and notice any hands that go up in the question time. So welcome to this hybrid event on how to build democracies with foresight. My name is Abby Innes. I'm an associate professor here at the European Institute at the LSE, and I'm really delighted this evening to be joined by Professor Albena Azmanova and Kalypso Nicolaidis. Now, before I introduce them properly, I need to do a little bit of housekeeping, namely to ask you to put your phones on silent, if you wouldn't mind, because this event is being recorded and we're hoping to put this up as a podcast. So you'll appreciate the peaceful background will be incredibly helpful. There will be an opportunity, of course, to put your questions to the speakers. And because we're both online and present here, I'm going to try and take a combination of questions, both from online audience members as well as people here. So obviously I'll signal when that's going to happen. For those of you on social media, the hashtag for this event is LSEEI. And that brings us to the substance, which is that it's really hard to think of another period in kind of recent history when the world has been kind of more in need of long-term perspective and long-term strategies, and seemingly less capable of generating them and applying them. And so to help us try and understand that paradox of democratic time, we have two speakers who I think are unusually well qualified to speak to this, because they're not just both theorists of democracy and of democratic capitalism, but also significantly practitioners, because they've both acted as policy advisors. So Professor Albena Azmanova, to my right, is Professor of Political and Social Science at City University, also a Senior Fellow at Bard College. She's also co-director of a Radical Critical Theories Circle and founder and co-editor of the journal Emancipations. She's won numerous very prestigious book awards, but I think one of the most significant is the Michael Harrington Award, the American Political Science Association, which cited the book saying it's an example of how scholarship can be used in the struggle for a better world, which I think any social scientist would be, pretty happy to have rendered in their name. She's also been an advisor to the European Parliament, to the European Parliament's Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs. Professor Kalypso Nicolaidis is chair in global affairs at the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence, where she convenes the EY Democracy Forum. Good evening, Kalypso. She's currently on leave from Oxford, but she's also been a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and at the École Nationale d'Administration in Paris. She has also been a policy advisor across an amazing number of institutions. She has advised both the Greek, the Dutch and UK governments, the European Parliament, the European Commission, the OECD and UNCTAD. So we have a very nice dynamic structure for this evening. So Albena is going to speak for 30 minutes. Kalypso is then going to comment for a further 10, and then we're going to open it up. So please take notes as you listen, put down questions that occur to you, because we'll get to you pretty quickly. Thank you very much. Albena.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Abby. Very happy to be here. Very anxious to talk about the difference between future-oriented policy and policy with foresight. Well, currently, across the ocean, the US president has kind of crushed these two moments together, the present and the future, as he is crafting the future American greatness with a chainsaw right now. So what does it mean to orient our present day policy towards the future with the foresight, rather than as Jonathan White once put it, disciplining the future through some fixed utopia and pursuing it in a pedantic doctrinal way. As some of you know, I grew up in a society in my native Bulgaria where we had to sacrifice the present for a bright future. And this is really not the project I'm going to be presenting here, not a version of that. So democracy with foresight. But before I dig into the substance of the project Kalypso and I are developing, let me give you a little bit of the backstory or the kitchen of our research together. Now, Kalypso Nicolaidis and I have been working for a while on transformative European policy. And most recently, we have been particularly troubled by the paradoxical loss of democratic agency in democratic societies. Because now Democrats, the ordinary people living in democracies who are socialized to value democracy, that's who I call Democrats. The Democrats, through free and fair elections, are putting democracy on its deathbed, as electoral support for the far right is growing across Europe and across the liberal democracies at large. So until recently, we worked on these issues separately and from quite different perspectives. I approached the matter through a critique of contemporary capitalism, which brought me to the depressing conclusion, a very depressing skepticism about the capacity of democracies to self-correct, of capitalist democracies to self-correct, and of the EU to live up to its own devout commitments. Now, Kalypso's perspective and path has been different. You probably know her as a scholar who has worked for 15 years at least on what she calls sustainable integration. But for most of us, she is one of the most incorrigible democratic optimists who ever lived. So she kept her faith while I was getting more and more skeptical or even pessimistic about our democracies. She kept her faith that we just have to do democracy differently, more creatively. Now, 2 years ago, the European Trade Union Institute asked us to co-author a chapter, a piece of writing on how Europe could pull off socially sustainable transition. And so, one skeptic, one optimist, we came together to work on this topic, which evolved into a project, hopefully a book, on what Kalypso has called democracy with foresight. So what do you get when you put together a skeptic and an optimist? Our collaboration, you can imagine, we disagreed a lot. But these are a skeptic and an optimist who value each other's perspectives and take each other's insights seriously. So what it has produced, I think, is a sort of, I would call it a critical realist viewpoint on the contemporary conundrum, historical juncture. That means for us, we steer away from wishful thinking. We are not trying to prescribe felicitous scenarios for Europe's future, but instead focus on articulating the conditions that might enable Democrats to think big again about the kind of society they want to inhabit or the kind of future worth fighting for. So we are very happy to present this project. It's a work in progress. There are lots of loose ends still, of course, and we are very happy to present this here because LSE's European Institute has exactly battles with these issues, and also we have been very much influenced by the work of Jonathan White on how to open up the possibility for European democracies or for democracies to think the future again. And we tackle some of the concrete implications of his analysis. Okay, so here's the project. Our point of entry is the following contradiction, what we call the paradox of democratic time. It goes something like this. In the early 21st century, European societies, but also generally Western democracies, are at the height of their affluence, we're rich, scientific brilliance, our scientists know how to clean debris from space, and institutional sophistication. We have long traditions of democratic, of robust democratic institutions. Yet, this society's capacity to navigate the future has dramatically eroded since the turn of this century. Sure, it has been the hallmark of democratic politics to tend to sacrifice long-term and global policy commitments to short-term and local concerns. Simply, people like to live better now. We cannot expect any different. This is the infamous presentism of democracies that is an acknowledged flaw, weakness of democracy. It's penchant for the present and the local, because people simply live here and now. As Jonathan White has very powerfully pointed out in his recent work, democracies are also future-oriented. It's a cumulative project pursued over time, but this is always anchored in the present and oriented towards the future. Now, moreover, the post-war era witnessed an unprecedented rise in future-oriented institutions, both domestically and internationally, from the welfare state to international organizations such as the UN and the transnational entity that is the European Union. Now, take the EU Commission. It is a powerful decisional body that is not democratically elected. It has, therefore, an exceptional capacity for thinking long-term because it escapes the presentism. What Kalypso has called the silver lining of the EU's democracy deficit. So, we all know about democracy deficit, that decisional bodies of the EU, such as Commission, are not democratically elected, and they have so much power. But Kalypso has pointed there is the silver lining to that, because they can take care of the long view. Such institutions being embedded in an ecosystem of democratic practices and procedures are meant to harness another feature of democracies that are very important in our understanding of democracy. And this is the fact that as compared to other types of societies, democracies are uniquely capable of garnering collective intelligence. That is the experiential intelligence of ordinary people, what Aristotle used to praise as the phronesis, as practical wisdom. To this adds another peculiarity of contemporary European democracies, the unprecedented high level of education, information, and awareness. Our societies have never been so educated as now, so well informed. And surveys actually show that most people are aware of the need for acting long-term, of taking care of the future of the planet, for instance, the great majority of citizens do care about climate change and support global social justice. So it's not like they don't care and don't know. And yet, even as our democracies are nowadays more capable than ever of pursuing grand political ambitions, and they have formulated those ambitions. As Klaus Hofer once noted, I really like that observation, we all know what needs to be done. And so our democracies have the capacity to anchor their present into a better future. That would be democracy with foresight. But they keep chaining their future to an anxious present. So this is, the paradox of democratic time. That is our entry point. So the decisional process in contemporary democracies is marked by a clash between, on the one hand, grand political ambitions that surpass parochial concerns, which, as I said, is backed up with a real capacity to deliver. But on the other hand, political choices tend to be increasingly parochial. So we argue that times are changing in contradictory ways. Collective time is shrinking again under the diktat of emergency politics and the pressure of competitiveness in the global market. So all kinds of crises, but also the pressures of competitiveness. While at the very same time, the need to act long-term has never been so pressing and so universally acknowledged. Our democracies, we like to say, are afflicted by a myopic tunnel vision. So a combination of two afflictions, tunnel vision, narrow, and myopia. Of course, the eternal flow of democracy, the presentism, is accentuated by the ubiquity of the instantaneous. We have instantaneous production, global media, technological revolutions. And this ubiquitous immediacy narrows the horizon of people who are already trapped in the tyranny of the present, marked by rising inequality, insecurity, discrimination, etc. So, but on the other hand, the awareness is growing, as I said, of the need for urgent action long-term. Now, one popular explanation of this conundrum, this tension, has been the proliferation of emergencies nowadays, as the complexity of modern societies make naturally these societies ungovernable somehow. Public health emergencies, now defense emergencies, the so-called polycrisis. As Jonathan White has pointed out, short-termism emerges because policy is reactive. Autocracy emerges from the need to crisis manage, to act fast. It's logical. We add to that is true, but we add to that a different source of short-termism. The endogenous, the internal demand for short-termism and autocracy within democratic societies. Why do people actually want this? As it is shown in the elections. The anti-democratic and anti-liberal type of agency that is being developed within our societies. We believe, this is our direction of research, our focus, if you wish, that at the root of this conundrum is a particular combination between political economy and institutional infrastructure in contemporary democracies, or rather a negative dynamic between the political institutions and the political economy of contemporary modernity, which seems to affect democracies more acutely than autocratic regimes. So let me first say a few, cover the political economy bit of this. The paradox of democratic time has much to do with the phenomenon of mass precarization, the political economy of what I have described in my work as precarity capitalism. Mass precarization, not just the precarity of those on temporary jobs and the poorest people, but the precarity of the masses, of the multitude, was something that Pierre Bourdieu noticed already in the 90s in a speech. He never analyzed that, but he noted it, that there is this tendency. Currently, a handful of people are focused on studying precarity, while the majority of scholars are focused on inequality. So people like Paula Apostolidis and I believe that what deeply afflicts our societies is indeed precarity. So we have not simply now what Guy Standing has called a precarious class. We have a precarious multitude. The economic insecurity is increasing for the majority of people as our livelihoods, our jobs, our careers, our pensions, our investments, so all the ways in which we provide for the necessities of life have become deeply insecure. So this is true for the poor and the rich, young and old, highly skilled or not. It is true even for those who have stable job contracts, because work pressures are so high that the anxieties ruin their mental health and people cannot maintain that employment. At the same time, many, especially the young, cannot even get their first job, so they're long-term unemployed, which is another form of precarity. So while inequality is much discussed, economic insecurity is the invisible disease that is ruining our societies. Now, to clarify a little bit further this diagnosis about the political economy of contemporary democracies, in my analysis of precarity, I see it not just as a state of uncertainty. And actually, I would say uncertainty is good. Who wants certainty? But a peculiar condition of disempowerment, which is rooted in the insecurity of livelihoods. And that disempowerment is experienced by individuals as incapacity to cope, and by societies as incapacity to withstand adversity and to govern themselves, as we saw in the case of the COVID pandemic. In other words, if we feel we can cope with uncertainty, we are not precarious. So as I noted in my last book, Capitalism on Edge, mass precarity or ubiquitous precarity is politically generated. It is not just a feature of current day modernity. It is not a matter of the complexity of modern life. And that's very important, because if we know what policies create precarity, we can do something about that. Okay, since the turn of the century, just to cut the long story short, to pinpoint which policies are the culprit of this epidemic of precarity, as I like to put it. Now, since about year 2000, competitiveness, not competition, competitiveness in the global integrated market became the top policy priority. It was written, for instance, the first time emerged that word in the Lisbon Treaty, that pledged to make Europe the most competitive economy, the EU the most competitive economy by 2020. So this competitiveness in the global market, as it became top policy priority, in its name, center-left and center-right governments equally started slashing both social spending and job stability because they needed nimble economies for the sake of businesses that can compete in the world, but also with sweetheart deals for the most competitive companies. So a plethora of policies that I have analyzed. But competitiveness is this what is driving the rest. So nowadays, the European Union has doubled down on competitiveness. We have the competitiveness compass, that all the policies is being judged through this compass. And in the name of competitiveness, the EU is mutilating its most progressive policies, such as the Green Deal, the AI liability directive, the due diligence directive. So what gets sacrificed again and again are job stability, investment in public services, and care for the environment. Let me tell you about one political technique, a very curious political technique in generating precarity. And this is individual responsibilization, or making individuals and societies responsible for things actually they cannot deliver. And this is done very often in the name of democracy, as if you give more responsibilities to people, you're helping democracies. There is this kind of thinking. So governments increasingly offload their responsibilities on us. We're expected to manage our own well-being, our health, education, employability, safeguarding the environment. You know the story. At EU level, the European Commission is asking governments to do more for social policy, which sounds great, very progressive. But at the same time, it is asking them to cut social spending. And now we're diverting regional development funds into rearmament. And so as we are asked to do more with less, we feel we cannot cope because while our responsibilities increase, we don't have the resources, be it time, skills, money, to fulfill those responsibilities, to find a job, be great at that job, raise a family, and on top of that, be informed and engaged citizens. So this misalignment between responsibilities and resources is disempowering and is the main engine of precarity for all. This grave situation, as bad as it is rapidly getting worse with the current arms race, as the European Commission has announced that is going to boost defense spending by 800 billion over the next 4 years without any public consultation. And I believe this is the death sentence for green and social justice. Remember, the most polluting human activity is war. And also, in order to have markets for goods, there must be consumption. How do we consume armament? Through war. This is the logic in capitalist societies. So the consequences of mass precarity are devastating. I'm moving on towards this point about political agency. Precarity does not simply generate consent and mistrust, because discontent and mistrust, because discontent and mistrust can be rather an engine of progressive social change and can nurture solidarities, but precarity works in a different way. One of the most dangerous features of mass precarity is that it is politically debilitating. It leaves us without time or energy or even the belief, the headspace to engage in politics, to act and have an impact. In other words, to be thinking and acting political agents. On the one hand, people feel disempowered and exhausted, but on the other, they long for stability and security because precarity makes you value more stability and security. That is why they're willing to support strong men, as they lack agency. Of course, they're seeking for very strong agency elsewhere. Strongmen who promise to provide this fast stability without bordering with the rule of law and the lengthy process of democratic consultation. So the more politically impotent, disempowered people feel, and again, due to specific policies, the more they demand powerful leaders to provide security with an iron fist. This is how we have our societies or our governments have replaced the rule of law with a rule of law enforcement. Even centrist governments have done that by popular demand. By popular demand, that is the really worrying thing. Another outcome of ubiquitous precarity is that it undermines solidarities, as everyone is focused on their own social and economic survival. Instead of solidarities, precarity fosters competition for victimhood, or what I like to call victimhood Olympics among disadvantaged and disempowered groups, because the claim to be a victim nowadays secures access to ever diminished resources. Remember, responsibilities are growing, we don't have the means, so we need shortcuts to these resources. But in these victimhood Olympics, one group of victims fights another group of victims as enemies, instead of seeking together the causes of their suffering and demanding accountability from those who are responsible, seeking out the culprits. It is not surprising then that anti-democratic forces rise to power through the very channels of democratic politics, free and fair elections. With a political economy that generates massive insecurity that fosters both frustration with the political establishment and fear of change, because we want stabilization when we're unstable, democratic elections do what they're supposed to do: translate personal anxieties into politics, hence the far-right rebellion across democracies. So anxious societies, in other words, produce anxious democrats who propel to power autocrats that crush our freedoms and bring democracy to its deathbed. And this situation cannot be remedied simply with more democracy, as a lot of democratic theorists would tell you. Because the familiar mechanisms of democracy, elections, referenda, even increased representation of workers on company boards, cannot, override the anxieties that the political economy of precarization creates. Okay. Why are our available mechanisms so futile, especially elections? We think that it is because when we cast our vote, we act alone. And when we're alone, we feel the most precarious. So we give vote, the vote expresses our worst fears. So we will be seeking solutions in that direction. We seek solutions, Kalypso, Nicolaidis, and I, at the intersection between political economy and democratic institutions. So in order to articulate this junction where the two meet, we use a distinction between democratically responsive and socially responsible style of rule. So this would, we hope, to help us articulate the difference between future-oriented policy and policy with foresight. Okay, so to repeat, democratically responsive, you know what it is. So far-right politics are democratically responsive. Yeah, they respond to the immediate concern of people. And socially responsible rule. Now, democratically responsive style of rule is one that responds to people's concerns, but without regard for the broader or longer term impact of the adopted policies. So what is the difference with socially responsible rule? It is one that is responsive in a different way, to a broadest possible way, by including its remits publics that may be absent or invisible now. Publics that may not be even human, but by their state, by the way they treat them, they act as a bellwether for the wider parameters of our well-being. So we argue that we need systematically to equip our democracies with democratic foresight, meaning socially responsible rule. In short, the mass appropriation of our horizon scanning, as we said, democracies are able to harvest these practice-based intuitions in people to achieve shared goals. So our hypothesis is, in order to achieve this, a lofty goal, we need both a new formula for the political economy of modern democracies and new institutional mechanisms that bridge end of the world concerns with end of the month concerns. Now, to be sure, lots of work has been done on future studies. Governments are increasingly building up capacities for strategic foresight, not least through incipient national ministries for the future. But this capacity is, concerns, closed scientific and bureaucratic entities. Of late, the EU started seriously to invest in anticipatory governance through its so-called better regulation toolbox in order to move from a broadly reactive to strategic policy culture. That sounds great. But that engagement remains reserved to closed and technocratic institutional settings, such as the Commission Foresight Task Force, Competence Center of Foresight, etc. We're interested in a democratic path of anticipatory governance. There are such attempts. The Finnish parliament has set up its Committee for the Future in 1993, making it one of the first parliamentary bodies in the world dedicated to future studies. So many fixes have been proposed for the crisis of democracy, but the collective import, the democratic import of anticipation has been largely left out of these discussions, as if the presentism of democracy was a fatality. So we do not, I've been convinced by Kalypso's optimism not to treat this as a fatality and try to do something about it. What helps us articulate that anticipatory capacity for democracy is a certain ontology or vision of democracy, of pluralism in democracy, that I have suggested. I have not even checked with Kalypso how to call that. I'll call it simultaneous pluralism. So we have heard often that democratic society is pluralistic because there's a plurality of interests. But actually, there is more plurality than that. Each of us has a plurality of interests. I'm a mother, I'm an academic, I am, a citizen. So I'm interested, I have short-term and long interests. So within each of us, there's a tension between the long-term and the short-term. And the issue is, how can we, what kind of democratic institutions, what kind of policies especially social and economic policies, can help in each of us prioritize the longer term over the parochial, the longer term and the broader perspective over the shorter and the parochial one. So how can the paradox of democratic time be resolved? Am I going very, how long have I been?
A little bit over half.
Over, okay. So I'm coming down to our proposals. So I can stop here, or I can tell you how we propose to solve the issues. I guess you'll let me go.
I want to know now.
Yes. So how can the paradox of democratic time be resolved? We claim that we need to focus neither on technocratic capacity for planning, nor on devising visions of the future. So we think in terms of enabling conditions, helping Democrats to think big again, and we advance 3 proposals, just 3. So as I said, reactionary politics is driven by precarity. Our first proposal concerns the political economy, but uncertainty and insecurity is not the problem. The disempowerment through incapacity to cope is the problem, the misalignment between responsibilities and resources, skills, time, money, to carry out these responsibilities. So the answer is empowerment through aligning very carefully responsibility and power at all levels of governance, at all spheres of action. So aligning responsibilities and resources, not resilience. So we have to steer away, ward off the terribly wasteful state of affairs where those who will be held responsible for delivering on the long term are not the ones who have the power to do so, as is currently they say. So in that sense, the narrative of inclusive prosperity around which economic policy is being crafted is populist. Because considering the high financial cost of the green transition, people know that they will have to sacrifice their economic well-being. That's why people are not buying it. Inclusive prosperity. People are not stupid. So we need to replace the promises of prosperity with that of economic stability. So we explore ways to reshape our political economy around the idea of voluntary employment flexibility, which would equip citizens with both economic security and time free for political and social engagement, if we all work less. Of course, we'll have less, but it will be a stable wealth that will allow us to think about the future, to project, to have plans. Because without stability, you cannot plan, no matter how rich you are. And then, in terms of, so the third proposal, we explore various democratic innovations and ask under what conditions these could be generalized. We start with citizens' assemblies connected with direct democracy. And we're actually experimenting this now with Kalypso with a project called the Democratic Odyssey. So special citizens' assemblies that are designed in such a way as to harness the creative and critical emancipatory potential of antagonistic conflicts by directing citizens' attentions towards the common roots of their conflicting grievances, and then helping citizens allocate political responsibility to those who have actually generated, the harm that they suffer. So designed in this way, citizens' assemblies avoid the short-sightedness of other forms of democratic input, such as elections and public consultations. We are now conducting pilot runs of a project for a permanent People's EU Assembly. We had 2 runs in Athens and in Florence. The next one in May is in Vienna. Another trajectory of experimentation with democratic institutions is around a Kalypso's idea of the democratic panopticon, that is designing, people surveillance of the decision makers. So turning the panopticon inside out. So those who are making the decisions feel at all times observed. And maybe Kalypso will say more about that. This is really her idea. So there are many other such democratic innovations which can be thought of as constituting the third democratic transformation after the ancient cities and national parliaments, which are, its core is about really making good on the paradox of democratic time. Now, I will pass over to Kalypso to maybe clarify a few things.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. That's a very good set of provocations to lead us into the next speaker. For those online, we're just tuning back into Kalypso. There we go.
Yes, thank you, Abby, and thank you for welcoming me at LSE's European Institute that has so often been so hospitable to me. So I'm only excited to actually join you, sadly virtually from Florence. And I am very eager to hear the discussion. So I'll just comment on a couple of points. First of all, on what's at stake. After all, in the place where Jonathan has presented his book, brilliant book, there's no convincing to be had. But I think the formulation that Jonathan offers in his book about democracy as a belief in the openness of the future really speaks to our moment right now, where what is Trump, what is Netanyahu, Erdogan, the huge upheaval that we're seeing in this moment, what is it then a closing of future? And indeed, yes, hope, perhaps hope over optimism, as Albena was saying, means that somehow those who are pushing back, the protests that we are seeing, whether in Turkey or Israel or anywhere else around the world right now, is about a vision of democracy that is, in spite of it all, we are keeping faith in the future. And so the question we're all asking, indeed, against this finite time, how do you open time, is, and what Albena just discussed in great detail is, okay, how does democracy's long-term credential pan out? And in what form? What are the variations around this theme? And maybe in this additional remark, we could keep in mind the example of the Green New Deal and the creeping reversal that has happened, both the New Deal at the EU level, at national level, at all sorts of levels, the pressures of lobby, not just the New Deal, but the due diligence directive and global, all sorts of transnational governance agreement that are increasingly put in question. And I think that what we can see is what is illustrated here in terms of the solution is that a number of points. One is, yes, the be-all and end-all of democracy is to start with accountability when we're talking about representative democracy. Accountability, so for delivering in time. But what we see today is that if you have accountability, if you have a simple democratic panopticon, first of all, it's hard to obtain for people to know that the resources are invested in the long term. But without empowerment to act upon them, it doesn't go very far. Then the second point is that ownership real ownership, visible ownership, is what lends efficiency to these policies. And indeed, because it does lead to accountability in different time frame, and above all, the ownership of all the trade-offs that we discuss in democracy. Democracy is not a harmonious process, but it's about the social ownership of the trade-offs that are involved in acting in the long term. Now, part of the issue is that we have lived indeed in these times of crisis, emergency politics, and that we need instead continuous governance. And the democratic institutions are able to provide slow, yes, that is the drawback of democracy, slow but continuous governance. And if we believe in the political economy of precarity that Albena discussed in great detail, what people who are not able to continuously be involved in is that they need continuous infrastructures to be involved in democratic process when they can and when it's possible. So if we have crisis management through different modes of participatory involvement, then these involvements should not be in moments of crisis. They need to be continuous. They need to be through an ecosystem of participation. And this is why when we discuss democracy for the long term, we need to look at ongoing connections and ecosystem between, yes, representative democracy, but those are moments, temporary moments of democracy supplemented by various other forms of participation. And the crucial point here is that the name of the game is capture. Is pushing against capture of the state, capture of resources, extraction, capture by elites who colonize the future. And what are the mechanisms that push back against this capture? So that's really what we explore in the book. And then we discuss different, indeed, innovations that do that. And Albena has already alluded to them, and I'd be very happy to expand in the Q&A. But I didn't want to take more than 4 minutes because I see that time is running out and we need to hear the discussion.
Thank you so much, Kalypso. That was a really wonderfully succinct setup. But I think raising this question of capture is also an important and interesting one. So if I'll open it straight up to the, I definitely have a few questions, but let me open it straight up to the floor and to friends online. I'll take questions in probably rounds of 3. So if you have a question, it would be lovely to know who you are. If you're happy to identify yourself, tell us your name, any affiliation you have, any questions from the audience. So, lady here, thank you very much. There's a roving mic about to come your way.
Fabulous, if you can hear me.
Yeah,
My name is Irina von Wieser. I am, amongst other things, chair of the European Center for Populism Studies, where I met Albena, and a former vice chair of the Human Rights Committee in the European Parliament. And so it's lovely to see Kalypso, who was my classmate at the Kennedy School a very, very long time ago. I have a very quick comment and 2 very quick questions, I promise. The comment, and please forgive me that I beg to differ on the democratic deficit of the European Commission, but maybe that is a topic for another time. The question 1 for the pessimists amongst us is whether it's too late for democracy to recover. We've seen, as you rightly say, probably the zenith of liberal democracies around the turn of the century, now apparently back at the level of 1986 or so in terms of global population backsliding and autocratization. What does that mean? Where does that process actually stop? And is it going to be stopped? And the other question, I thought it was really, really interesting that you talked about realigning responsibility and power in decision making. And yes, I think citizens' assemblies are wonderful, but we already have local authorities, right? We have localism. So maybe if bringing power back to the local level and I'm a local politician here in London, I can tell you we definitely need more resources. If you gave more of that decision-making power to the smallest bodies or entities in our democratic societies, would that maybe make a positive difference? Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you for making those questions, not statements. Also, very much appreciating that. Any other questions for this first round? You might still be thinking, do we have a question online perhaps as well? Or not yet? Sir, would you like to go ahead?
Right.
Till it goes red, there we go.
Oh, I'm a slow learner, sorry. Evening, thank you so much for both your presentations. My name is Joachim von Hallas. I'm the chairman of Tuesday Club, a regular roundtable on geopolitics and geoeconomics here in London. My question to you is, you briefly came up with a term of society. Our economies have become too complex. Complexity as an issue against democracy. Could you evolve or deep dive on that a bit further, please? Thank you.
Fantastic. I think what I'd like to do here is Kalypso. Would you like to speak to those questions? And then I'll turn to Albena as well. Calypso, could you hear those questions?
Of course, yes, absolutely. And hello. And my God, it takes us back to a very long time ago, which shows that time is not an objective thing. And when you, of course, we all follow the ebbs and flows of democracy and the waves of democracy. But I would make 2 points. One is that indeed democratic backsliding is reversible to a great extent. We've seen it in Poland. Reversibility comes from an array of actors, starting with civil society, starting with people who seek an open future, who seek to a self-determination and the intrinsic value of democracy, as well as, of course, what they think it can deliver for them. And so I'm not as pessimistic as you imply. And indeed, yes, civil society, but often, of course, ourselves, universities, places of knowledge, businesses often also see the intrinsic value of open systems, at least some businesses, civil servants as opposed to bureaucrats, actors, and indeed we have some issues with us about the state versus corporate power. Where is power? Those who see that indeed where power is hugely fragmented in our societies, it needs to be accountable, dispersed but accountable. And so I think that, and of course, this is reversible in our societies that have experienced democracy in people's memories. But if you also think of what we could call the democratic geopolitics, the geopolitics of democracy, a lot of thinking is to be done now on whether citizens in China believe that their regime promises the long term. Why don't they invest in their savings in banks, but they put them under the mattress? Do we really believe that that citizens in autocracy are better placed and believe that their governments are better placed to deliver the future, whether it's climate, AI, new technologies, security, etc.? And there's been very interesting polling on this front, which I think leaves it very open. Now, the second bit of the question is about localism. And I think that when we speak increasingly these days, we talk about the fact that all of these democratic innovations that we debate really start with the local and are more credible locally. And that may be true, but what matters is really a time when we are considering translocal connections, translocal mutuality, as well as transmodal, combining modes, combining levels, And it's this complexity, it's the complexity of democratic organization itself that we need to consider, even if localism is a very fundamental part of the story.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Albena.
Yes. Irina, about is it too late? I think that now publics are experimenting with affiliations with the far right. It's a moment of experimentation. It depends how the alternative forces will respond. There are so many ideas. I have advised for 2 decades now that we focus on fighting precarity rather than just inequality, and there is not actually work done on that. So there are ideas for changing course of economic policy that can address people's concerns, and I think then people will withdraw their support to reactionary politics. We need to give them a plausible alternative. Not this what I call the populism of the center, to promise things that no reasonable person would just accept at face value, such as inclusive prosperity. We're past that point. So as to going local, yeah, the European Union has this wonderful principle of subsidiarity. So do what you can do locally and then go up from there. But I don't want to romanticize that very much, because look what Trump is doing now. This is exactly his narrative of cutting federal government and transferring the responsibility down to states. So closer to the people. The idea is actually to allocate the right type of policy to the right level where they're the most efficient and makes sense, and then to have the mechanisms of accountability. So, subsidiarity, I would say, and aligning at each level, responsibility with resources. The complexity. There is, do we live in the risk society really? Is this a matter of the complexity of modernity? I don't know. What I know is that there have been specific policies that have created insecurity, and we need to override those policies, rather than blaming that insecurity on the growing complexity of modernity. So that's the only point I want to make. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
More questions? If there's yes, do.
Do I need to hold this?
Again, do identify yourself if you're comfortable.
Hello, my name is Dora. Hello, my name is Dora. My background is in political philosophy, so I suppose my question kind of comes from that angle. But I suppose my question also comes from the angle of being a young person. I think that, and I guess a lot of research in psychology as well shows that for a lot of young people, their idea of the future is not perhaps just that it's bleak, but maybe even I would suggest that it does not exist. When you look at research into the kind of infantilization or kind of delayed adulthood phenomenon, the fact that for young people, all of these milestones that are traditionally considered to be the hallmarks of adulthood, such as getting on the property ladder or having a kind of stable career and income, etc., are happening later and later, and actually perhaps for some young people are just simply not happening. I guess my question is kind of, do we think that the future still exists as an ontological category for young people? And do we think that perhaps part of the work that needs to be done from an institutional level and a policy level has to also be to convince young people that the future is not just something worth fighting for, but actually still exists?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. If ever there was a more damning testament to our contemporary politics. I think it may be that phenomena. So thank you very much for articulating that. Kalypso, again, would you like to come in there?
I obviously, when so many young people decide that they don't want to have children, not just because of what the future will do to these potential kids, but what those kids would do to the future of a habitable planet. So it goes in both directions. Indeed, this is the ultimate ontological sense in which the future doesn't exist. And it's and so this angst that you're talking about is not just a cohort effect, an effect due to age. Of course, there's always been the effect of age of unknown future, angst about the future, but really this cohort, this moment in time, never before has there been such sense of anxiety towards the future. And it's fascinating and so scary that it translates into a disillusionment about the structure that failed to offer this future. And if it's democracy, then we're not going to do democracy. But what I see in response in many places around the world is that if the response is not pure despair and separation of oneself from the collective enterprise, then there is a lot of movements that have to do with creating informal public goods, local self-empowerment, whether we're talking about housing communities, energy communities, education communities. And maybe this is back to the question of localism, but there are so many different new and innovative ways that also this young generation finds in trying to reclaim that future that it doesn't believe anymore. What we see is that it's just refuses increasingly to delegate the response to this deep ontological anxiety. And that's what we need to build on when we talk about democracy with foresight, because these communities, of course, are concerned about the here and now, but in conversation that constantly link it to this ontological question, Dora. So that's what I find fascinating in these kind of self-empowered movement. And for instance, when we had the last conversations in the Democratic Odyssey with, randomly selected ordinary citizens, they imagined how these communities could exist and have democratic debates and then connect with one another, and only little by little bring those who are supposed to have the levers of power, whether it's representative of the state, corporations, and the likes, but set an agenda. So reverse inclusiveness, not just demand and plead for inclusiveness, not just demand and plead for, the radicality of sunlight and transparency of how power is used and our resources are used, but owning the conversation and then bringing in those with power. So I see rays of hope in that kind of emerge from such despair.
Thank you very much. Albena.
So you're asking about the future as an ontological category. I'm not convinced that the future has disappeared from the horizon of the young. If I look at surveys, striking, young people are worried about poverty in old age. This is the one of the most striking things I discovered when I was looking at the reasons for youth support of the far right in Germany. So they project, they see a future, but this is a future of being worse than their parents. So I wonder though, and you have to tell me, is it a lack of future or is it fear of social sliding? Is it because our societies have it so good that the next generation is afraid they're not going to live as well as their parents? Or is it a really incapacity to plan for the future because you're so insecure now that you need certain, certainty, stability in order to be able to project from now to tomorrow and to the day after, to plan to buy a house. So I don't know. I see different data that suggests different things, and I wonder. Yeah, it's a good question. How young people see the future.
I might abuse chair's privilege and jump in with a question. Really, I want to make quite an abstract point and then really specify it, which is I wonder how much the crisis in being able to imagine the future comes from the sort of failure of high modernist understandings of our power, not least in relation to nature. So the 20th century is a long 20th century of beliefs in mastery through technology and over nature, and that we can somehow overcome radical uncertainty so that we can make a prosperous, efficient, and always resilient society. And clearly that's failing across multiple fronts. And there's a particular manifestation of that, I think, which is the primacy of neoclassical economics in the West in the last sort of 40 to 50 years, which doesn't work in historical time. It's a formal axiomatic deductive economics that works in logical time, often using mathematical formalism. And it thinks in terms of machine models of the economy. And in that sense, it's no less a misadventure in high modernism than Stalinist economics. It's just a different coordinating mechanism, right? They're both sciences in the allocation of things rather than political economic philosophies that seek to manage human flourishing in an inescapably uncertain and imperfectible world. So one of the things that keeps striking me about generations of economists, both at the Commission, across the EU, across national governments in Europe and beyond, not least the US, is that we've been doubling down on this machine model of the economy. If it's not working, it's because we haven't done enough of it. We've had 40 to 50 years of an economics in which we're expecting people to conform to an economic blueprint rather than thinking in terms of what do people need, what are they representing to us as democratic institutions, how do we respond to that? So we've been expecting societies to conform, they've been failing to conform, as inescapably they must, because we're not able to create a machine world. And that's created a world of unanticipated consequences, grotesque caricatures of the political economies that were promised, and a sort of collapse in legitimacy for our sort of status quo. But then what next? How do we change that? So at this point, not least because Kalypso was talking about problems of state capture, and you're talking about this, the kind of technocracy, the sort of how do you escape technocratic understandings of what's going on? Would it be enough at this point to change economic orthodoxies, to open it up to analytical pluralism, to admit that the existing orthodoxies have failed, and failed kind of ontologically and epistemologically? It's not just kind of mild technocratic failures. They fail utterly. They are a misrepresentation of what's possible. Or is capture too extensive at this point? Could ideas shift interests at this point? And what would it take to instigate that shift, do you think? This is a huge question, but we're dealing with huge issues.
Well,
so have a crack at that.
Okay. So in a way, you're talking about the capture of scientific thought by neoclassical economics.
Yes.
And there have been breakthroughs. There has always been a strand, of non-orthodox economists. But now I would defer you to the latest book of James Galbraith, where he proposes to shift the whole paradigm towards thinking from the perspective of entropy, He says that entropy is actually a more fruitful category to understand human societies than equilibrium, because neoclassical economics thinks in terms of equilibrium, assumes this equilibrium. So human-focused economics would approach the whole thing from the idea of entropy. This is not my field. I would defer you to James Galbraith's last book as an example of this kind of novel thinking of breakthrough.
And actually, that would be very consistent with ecological economics, which is often drawn on the ideas of entropy in the biophysical world. Kalypso, maybe you want to speak particularly to or I could ask you to speak particularly to the ideas of the social democratic left as well in Europe in terms of kind of new economic thinking. Where do you see economic thinking that seems to transcend the boundaries of these debates that have not allowed us to escape our pessimism, our lack of future? Where do you see those kind of new economic ideas breaking through, having any success?
It's interesting that you speak of the social democratic left, because part of the feature of our times, and back to Dora's question, also connecting it with the new generation, is that at least the new generation tends to see the challenges of planetary politics, which have to do with the long term and the Anthropocene, as not through the prism of ideologies. To the extent that we look at old isms, they're about, do they serve, what do they do to this agenda? But they're not the first prism. So that's one first point about ideology. The second is that, of course, the left has, the social democratic left has long critiqued the extractive quality of capitalism, extractive from the value of labor, but also increasingly the ecological left has turned to extraction from the resources of the earth. And so I think that the thinking beyond extraction has a long pedigree. And what we're doing these days is really rethinking and re-expanding our conversation about the global transnational characteristic of extraction, that it's not just extraction where you are, where you vote, where you decide if you vote for a social democratic party, but indeed extraction that is carried out in your name as a consumer around the earth. And this is why new generations tend to have such big movements of solidarity against capitalist extractions, whether it's rare earth, rare resources, or fossil fuel, it's set in Uganda or Nigeria or wherever. And at the cost not only of the planet's biodiversity, but the livelihood of local people, etc. So this interconnectedness of both the harms and the resistance to the harms of late financial capitalism, is really very pregnant. And one of the sources of inspiration, at least from the most kind of from many of the parts of the ecological movement, has to do with indigenous thinking, where we start to understand that so much of the resources, what is considered by capitalism, whether it's the planet or whether it's labor, is thought as a resource for capitalism to be extracted, as opposed to a source of life. So indigenous thinking is about changing our imagination about resources into sources. I find that this kind of thinking has not entirely made its way into social democratic or debates, that we are very much caught up still with how, reform of capitalism should be through change incentives, price mechanisms, bans, the role of the state versus the private sector. All of these are very important questions, because at the end of the day, we're not talking about revolutions, are we? We might, but we're not talking about once and for all transitions. We're talking about continuous incremental change. And if that's the case, all of these sub-debates in the field matter. But unless until we understand, for a translation would be that, you know, what is Amazon? How come Amazon, the corporation, is valued at billions, and Amazon, the oxygen of the lungs of the earth, is valued at nothing unless and until you lay bare its surfaces. So unless and until we can inverse this equation at the global level, and where are we going? And this is.
Yeah. Oh, I think the Wi-Fi has frozen in some way. Kalypso, that was a fully coherent answer, so I might sort of stop you there and move to what I believe is an online question. So, Louise, do you want to tell us what that is?
Yeah, we have a few actually, but I'll start with, is she back? No. With Yaprax. I'm going to read it. Thank you for this fantastic discussion. I am Yaprak Gursoy from the European Institute. I am the chair in contemporary Turkish studies, and I have two quick questions. Where do you see the potential of dangers of technology in all of this? Perhaps in the case of the democratic panopticon, should we look for ways to use new digital technologies and social media to connect and seek the roots of our common problems? Or do some of these technologies make us feel more alone and precarious? Second question is, you talked about anxiety. Have you considered anger as another important consequence of insecurity and people turning to strong men?
Fantastic, thank you very much.
Yeah, great. Well, definitely anger is an offspring of anxiety. For some people, and I believe maybe for most people, it is disempowering. But so anger can be good because it shows that at least we feel we have agency and we're entitled to an alternative rather than putting up. And the danger is that the normalization of precarity and of believing that there is no chance that you can change anything, that is the real danger. How did I put it? The debilitating aspect of precarization is more dangerous than the anger. The anger, we need anger. So technology and digital technologies, I personally believe, and I'm not sure where Kalypso stands on that technology is what you make out of it. It's a tool. It's a tool to connect or to disconnect. So I wouldn't blame technologies for the social evils, but the way it is used, the way it is regulated or not. So the issue is elsewhere.
Thank you very much. Kalypso, happy to have you back. Did you hear the question on technology?
No, I lost you. I don't know what happened, but it went off. But I'm sure that Albena has addressed it, so I'm happy to take another question.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for one last one, which is perfect. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm Jonathan. I'm studying here, doing a master's in public policy. And I have a question related more to technology, to the short long-termist discussion, and to the discourse in the field you operate in. So I'm personally pretty scared of the impacts AI can have on our democracies, be it through the erosion of public epistemics, be it through unemployment, be it through automation and resulting gradual disempowerment, for example. So my question would be, within your field, do you think there's currently discourse on that? Do you think this discourse is increasing? Are funds going towards research there? How do you see the future there? Thank you very much.
Okay, shall I go first? And then, so let's take automation through AI. It is so scary because we have been made to depend on a paid job to satisfy our needs. If we have a political economy that provides, the essentials of life without dependent on paid employment, we wouldn't be threatened by technology, loss of jobs. So I would blame the political economy that has increasingly cut all the, resources for public spending, has made reliance on good healthcare dependent on private funds rather than technology itself. So that's my short answer to this.
Thank you, Kalypso.
Like all the issues we discussed, there's always a dark side and a bright side. And I think that when we talk about the long term, we are at the end of the day, yes, we're projecting, yes, we're expanding, extrapolating on trends, but at the end of the day, it's about our democratic imagination, and it's about how we can think that collectively we can conjure up futures that we can live with, and maybe more. And so AI, of course, is full of fears, and that's what your question, Jonathan, expressed. It's the fear of displacement. Indeed, Albena spoke to it. But in democratic terms, the idea that somehow we could have AI machines discussing with one another, algorithm, we could have our own democratic avatar voting for us, internalizing our preferences, and then MPs' avatars and governments mostly through AI decision making, and a lot of it will happen. So the question that all our societies are asking is, how much control can we keep? We are envisaging a future that is cybernetic citizenship. And of course, the future is almost with us in China with the social credit system. And the idea that what government is about, and government for the long term, is aggregating preferences that can be expressed through all sorts of behaviors that will be voted pluses or minuses by these algorithms. And these are societies that will eventually externalize the value decisions that are made in democracy through this cybernetic citizenship, rather than the foundation of democracy, which is to have internalized values of other regardingness, values of dignity, collective dignity, and indeed of political freedom. So AI, to the extent that it's a mechanism for aggregating surveillance, control, aggregation, numbers, individual by numbers in society, an alternative way of aggregating preferences, is extremely scary. And if we combine it with the quantum leap, the future quantum revolution of quantum computing put together with AI, those who will control these technologies could control our lives. And so what the EU is trying to do with our democratic imagination is to ask in a relatively feeble way for the moment, okay, what can we do now? How can we backward engineering to put ourselves on a different path? Whatever will happen with China, or the mirror effect of surveillance capitalism and surveillance democracy in the US from corporations. So yes, we are in a Europe that is trying to kind of tread a third way between these two alternative technological controls, which will erase democratic leeway and freedom. Now, the approach of AI and democracy in the EU is to have different types of risks, to have different types of regulation, but regulation is always too late. So to me, yes, we need to continue to ask whether our state machineries, our corporate governance can do this, but we also want to work on our societal capacity. This is why a lot of what we're talking about in democracy with foresight is about the dispersion of a culture in schools, in enterprises, in neighborhoods, in local governments, in transnational governance, in translocalism, everywhere, of people's grappling with imagining these futures and asking how we can reverse engineer them. It has to do with our own capacity to feel in control of our life. You know, Harry would say, you just meditate twice a day and you won't be captured by AI. I'm not sure that's enough. It's about using AI, familiarizing with ourselves with AI so that we can use it as a good way to aggregate preferences. In fact, we've been playing with this in our own Democratic Odyssey experiment. We know the examples of Taiwan and many other examples around the world where, you know, with the police AI algorithm, we're using another one called Talk to the City. We're experimenting with AI algorithms that actually are transparent enough that they do for us what we can call democracy at scale. Really having lots and lots of people debating stuff and it leading somewhere because AI is helping us to do that. So there are many different other aspects of the better angels of our nature and how we can figure out ways of using technology better. I think we have to continue to push for corporations like Meta and Google and others to be governed by communities that learn to control the impact of AI on what they do. And there's really extremely interesting experiments in that way. And I could go on and on. The point is to weigh the scales on the side of a democratic use of AI. It's a huge challenge. So, and the challenge is really up to that, this future generation of ours that Dora was talking about. Frankly, wow, this is a future you need to grasp. This is a long-term challenge you need to grasp. And I would add, on the side of the hopefulness, that what AI is giving us today in the world is what we could call planetary sapience, our capacity as humanity to kind of know the planet, know every bit and pieces of biological, chemical, etc., realities of this planet and what creates the dynamics of the system and climate change and biodiversity depletion. We have this planetary sapience, and the reason we have it is through the combination of huge data models, AI, quantum computing, these technologies together. So the question is whether with this planetary sapience, we're going to be able to transform it into planetary wisdom. Can artificial intelligence lead to human intelligence in what we're going to do about this data? So that's the path of hope. And that is the path of owning the future against it being colonized by very foolish decisions we might make today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I'm afraid we've slightly gone over time. So attempt just to draw it together. What comes out of this conversation is how much is at stake and also how much jeopardy there is, that there's a dark trajectory and a much lighter trajectory. But in the lighter trajectory, what you hear is a chance to re-inject meaning into democratic politics, to take it away from technocratic tinkering and to re-embed democracy in a much better society, a much better represented society with a much stronger voice. And that's also about getting away from the technocratic idea that change comes from the top, that groups below the state can change the social facts on the ground by organizing with each other through different corporate forms, through different financial forms, and that what you've told us is that all of those things are emerging. So the question then becomes about scale, and when politics starts to, when party politics, as it were, starts to take on those changed facts. So Leszek Korzakowski, the Polish philosopher in the 80s, wrote a book called The Metaphysical Horror. So we haven't always been less pessimistic than we than we are now, in which he pointed out that it was better to teeter on the brink of the metaphysical horror with your eyes wide open than to live in flat out denial of it of its existence. So on that happy note, let me thank the speakers so much for 2 incredibly engaging presentations, and to all of you for coming and to asking really very pertinent and provoking questions. Thank you very much.